If you've ever watched someone be underestimated simply because they chose kindness over authority, if you've ever wondered what someone carried in silence before you knew them, then you understand that some of the strongest people in the world never announce their strength. This channel exists for those untold stories, the lives that remain invisible until one moment reveals everything. If these stories speak to you, if you believe that quiet service often hides extraordinary pasts, consider subscribing. You're part of a community that sees beyond the surface. Sarah arrived at the Veterans Care Facility each morning at 6:45, 15 minutes before her shift began. She always stopped at the small coffee station in the staff lounge and made a fresh pot, the rich aroma filling the quiet hallway before the day's chaos descended. Then she would pour 2 cups, one for herself, one for whoever might need it. She carried them down the long corridor to the common area, where the residents gathered, offering the second cup to whoever looked like they could use the warmth. The ritual had become so consistent over 3 years that some residents would wait for her arrival, positioning themselves near the entrance so they'd be first to receive the offering. It wasn't just about the coffee, though Sarah made it stronger and better than the weak institutional brew the kitchen produced. It was about being seen, being remembered, being worthy of someone's first thoughtful act of the day. Mr. Patterson would be there most mornings, sitting in his wheelchair by the window, watching for her car to pull into the parking lot. When he saw her arrive, he would wheel himself to the common area entrance and wait. Mrs. Chen would pause her morning routine of pacing the hallways, her anxiety about the day ahead momentarily forgotten when Sarah appeared with that second cup. Even Mr. Delgado, who trusted almost no one after decades of nightmares and paranoia, would accept coffee from Sarah's hands when he refused it from everyone else. The facility was a converted school building, its hallways still bearing the ghosts of classrooms and lockers. The high ceilings echoed with shuffling footsteps and the mechanical hum of medical equipment. Faded motivational posters from the school days remained on some walls, their messages about reaching for dreams now carrying an unintended poignancy. Now it housed 42 men and women who had served their country decades ago, their bodies failing but their memories sharp. Some had fought in Vietnam, waking each night to the sound of helicopters that existed only in their minds. Others had served in Korea, their joints aching with arthritis earned from sleeping on frozen ground. A few were from even earlier wars, their numbers dwindling with each passing year. Sarah had been working there for 3 years, ever since she finished nursing school. She was 26 years old, soft-spoken and patient in ways that seemed beyond her years. Her movements were economical and precise, never rushed but never wasted. When she spoke, people leaned in to hear her, not because her voice was weak, but because there was something in her tone that made listening feel important. The other nurses often commented on how she never seemed rattled. Even when residents became confused or agitated, even when families grew frustrated with the limitations of care, Sarah remained steady. She spoke quietly, moved deliberately, and treated every person with the same careful dignity. Some of the younger staff found her almost too calm, too controlled. They wondered if she was naturally that way, or if something had taught her to be. "She's like a robot," one nursing assistant had whispered in the break room, not unkindly, just confused. "Nothing ever gets to her. I've never even seen her cry." But the older nurses, the ones who had worked in healthcare long enough to recognize certain patterns, saw something else. They saw someone who had learned to compartmentalize, to stay functional under pressure, to keep moving forward when everything inside wanted to collapse. They recognized the signs of someone who had been through something profound and had come out the other side changed. But Sarah wasn't a robot. She felt everything. She had simply learned long ago that falling apart wasn't an option when people depended on you. She had learned that composure under pressure was a skill you developed because lives required it. She had learned to compartmentalize, to process later, to keep moving forward because stopping meant letting someone down. Sarah pushed her medication cart down the hallway, stopping at each room to deliver morning pills and check vital signs. She knew all 42 residents by name. She knew their histories, their families, their fears. She knew that Mr. Patterson liked his water ice cold and his room temperature exactly 70 degrees. She knew that Mrs. Chen wouldn't take her medications unless Sarah sat with her and talked about her grandchildren first. She knew that Mr. Delgado had nightmares about a jungle he hadn't seen in 50 years. She knew that Mr. Harrison had saved 3 men during his service, but lost 3 others, and the ones he lost were the ones he talked about. She knew that Colonel Mitchell had commanded troops in 2 wars, but never mentioned the commendations, only the soldiers he'd sent home in boxes. She knew that Mrs. Rodriguez had been an army nurse in Vietnam and still flinched at the sound of helicopters overhead. She knew these things because she listened. Not with the professional detachment some nurses maintained, but with genuine attention. When residents spoke about their past, Sarah didn't just hear words. She heard the weight behind them, the grief that time had softened but never erased, the pride mixed with pain. She moved through her rounds with quiet efficiency, her voice soft and reassuring. When Mr. Patterson complained about the physical therapist being too rough, Sarah listened without interrupting, letting him vent his frustration about bodies that no longer obeyed commands. When Mrs. Chen's hands shook too badly to open her pill bottle, Sarah opened it without making her feel diminished, maintaining the older woman's dignity. When she heard Mr. Delgado crying in his room at 3 in the morning, she sat with him until dawn, saying nothing, just present, a silent witness to pain that couldn't be spoken aloud. The night shifts were the hardest, but Sarah volunteered for them regularly. That was when the residents were most vulnerable, when memories crept in through the darkness and the thin protection of daylight routine fell away. She would walk the halls in the pre-dawn hours, listening for sounds of distress, checking on those who slept poorly, sitting with those who couldn't sleep at all. She had sat with Mr. Harrison through countless nights when the nightmares came. Nightmares of Morrison and Chen and Williams, the 3 men whose names he repeated like a prayer or a penance. She had held Mrs. Rodriguez's hand while she cried about the soldiers she couldn't save in field hospitals 50 years ago, boys who died calling for their mothers. She had listened to Mr. Delgado describe the same firefight for the 100th time, knowing that he needed to tell it, needed someone to bear witness to what he'd survived. Sometimes during these long nights, Sarah would think about her own sleepless hours, the nights when she lay awake seeing faces of soldiers she couldn't save. She understood what these residents carried because she carried similar weight. The specifics were different wars, different decades, different circumstances, but the burden was the same. The guilt of survival, the weight of impossible decisions, the faces that never faded. The facility operated on a tight budget. The staff was overworked and underpaid. Equipment was outdated and frequently broken. The building itself needed repairs that the administration couldn't afford. The elevator broke down regularly, forcing staff to help residents navigate stairs. The heating system was unreliable, leaving some rooms freezing in winter. The common area furniture was worn and mismatched, donations from various sources that didn't quite fit together. But Sarah never complained. She arrived early, stayed late, and filled in gaps wherever they appeared. When the kitchen ran short on supplies, she brought food from home, fresh fruit, good bread, real butter instead of the margarine packets the facility provided. When a resident's family couldn't afford new clothes, Sarah quietly purchased them herself, removing tags and presenting them as donations from anonymous sources to preserve the family's pride. When the activities director quit and wasn't replaced due to budget cuts, Sarah organized movie nights and card games during her breaks, creating moments of normalcy and connection. She did these things without announcement or expectation of recognition. She simply saw needs and filled them. When the facility director thanked her for covering another shift, Sarah would just nod and say it was fine. When other nurses asked why she did so much extra work, she would shrug and say she didn't mind. She deflected gratitude the way some people deflected criticism, automatically, almost uncomfortably. The other nurses noticed but didn't understand. Why would someone so young, so capable, stay in a place like this? She could work at a hospital, make better money, have better hours, deal with patients who weren't dying slowly from age and accumulated trauma. She could work in a private practice, somewhere clean and modern with patients who could actually get better. She's running from something, one nurse theorized during a break room conversation. Nobody chooses this life unless they're hiding. Or maybe she just cares more than we do, another responded, though even she sounded uncertain. "I think she understands them," said Maria, one of the older nurses who had worked at the facility for 15 years. "I think she's been through something similar. You can see it in the way she talks to them. She doesn't have that distance most of us maintain. She's right there with them." The truth was that Sarah wasn't running from anything. She was running toward something, toward a kind of peace she'd lost and was trying to rebuild, one cup of coffee and one small act of service at a time. She was looking for redemption, though she would never have named it that. One morning, she arrived to find Mr. Harrison sitting alone in the common area, staring at the wall. He was a Vietnam veteran, 83 years old, with a sharp mind trapped in a failing body. He rarely spoke to anyone, preferring to spend his days reading or watching the birds outside his window. But this morning, something was different. His hands were shaking and his eyes were distant, focused on something only he could see. Sarah poured a cup of coffee and sat down beside him. She didn't ask what was wrong. She simply sat there, holding her own cup, waiting. The silence stretched between them, comfortable rather than awkward. After several minutes, Mr. Harrison spoke. "I lost 3 men that day," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was their sergeant. I was supposed to keep them safe." Sarah listened. She didn't offer platitudes or false comfort. She simply listened, giving him the space to speak or not speak as he needed. "I see their faces every morning," he continued, his voice cracking with the weight of 56 years of guilt. "Been 56 years. Still see them. Every single morning when I wake up, there they are. Young, always young, while I got old." His voice broke on the last word. The weight of 5.5 decades of guilt and grief pressed down on him, visible in the slump of his shoulders, the tremor in his hands. Sarah set her coffee down and folded her hands in her lap. "What were their names?" she asked gently. "Mr. Harrison looked at her, surprised. No one had ever asked that before. People offered sympathy, thanked him for his service, told him it wasn't his fault. But no one had asked for the names. No one had asked him to remember them aloud, to speak their names and make them real again. He told her their names, slowly, carefully, as though speaking them aloud was both painful and necessary. Private First Class, David Morrison. Corporal James Chen, Specialist Robert Williams. He described each one, their hometowns, their families, their dreams of what they'd do when they got back home. Dreams that died in a jungle clearing on a day Mr. Harrison could never forget. Morrison had been 19, engaged to his high school sweetheart, planning to take over his father's hardware store when he got back. Chen had been 21, a college student who'd been drafted, who wrote poetry in his spare time and talked about becoming a teacher. Williams had been 20, the youngest of 6 children, who carried photographs of his siblings and talked about them constantly. Sarah listened to each one, repeating them back to ensure she had them right, treating each name with the reverence it deserved. When he finished, she said, "They're remembered. You've carried them all these years. That matters." Mr. Harrison's eyes filled with tears. "Does it? Does it matter? They're still gone. Their families still lost them. Morrison's fiancée married someone else. Chen's parents died without ever seeing him again. Williams's siblings grew up without their brother. What good does my remembering do?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Memory is how we honor the dead," she said finally. "It's how we keep them from disappearing completely. You've kept them alive in the only way that was left to you. That's not nothing, Mr. Harrison. That's everything." Mr. Harrison nodded once, unable to speak. Sarah sat with him until his hands stopped shaking, then quietly excused herself to continue her rounds. But she returned during her lunch break to sit with him again, and the next day she asked if he wanted to tell her more about Morrison and Chen and Williams. He did. Over the following weeks, Mr. Harrison began to open up in ways he hadn't in years. He told Sarah stories about his unit, about the good days as well as the bad. He talked about the bonds formed in combat, the dark humor that kept them sane, the small moments of humanity that persisted even in hell. And slowly, gradually, the weight he carried seemed to lighten slightly, not disappearing, but becoming more bearable because someone else now knew the names, now carried a small piece of his burden. The other staff members noticed the interaction. They saw how the residents responded to Sarah differently than they responded to anyone else. There was a trust there, a recognition, as though Sarah understood something fundamental about them that others didn't. As though she spoke a language they all knew but couldn't quite identify. "It's like she's been through something," Mrs. Rodriguez said to another resident one afternoon. "Something that changed her. You can see it in her eyes sometimes when she thinks no one's watching. There's a depth there, a knowledge of things most people her age haven't experienced." One afternoon, a new resident arrived. His name was Colonel Mitchell, a 90-year-old army officer who had served in Korea and Vietnam. He was sharp, demanding, and unimpressed with the facility. He criticized the food, the accommodations, the staff. He refused to participate in activities and barely spoke to anyone except to issue complaints. He'd been a battalion commander, accustomed to having orders followed instantly. Retirement hadn't softened him. The death of his wife 2 years earlier had only made him harder, more bitter. His children had tried to care for him at home, but his demands and his temper had exhausted them. One daughter had broken down crying, telling him she couldn't do it anymore. His son had stopped visiting altogether. The care facility was a last resort, and Colonel Mitchell made sure everyone knew he considered it a humiliating defeat. Sarah was assigned to his care. The other nurses were relieved. They had already grown tired of his attitude after just 2 days. Sarah introduced herself quietly, brought him his medications, and left without engaging his provocations. Over the following days, she maintained the same steady presence, never reacting to his criticism, never rushing him, never treating him as anything other than deserving of respect. When he complained that his coffee was too weak, she brought him a stronger brew without comment. When he criticized the way she'd arranged his medications, she rearranged them according to his specifications without defensiveness. When he accused her of being incompetent, she simply continued her work, her expression unchanged. Colonel Mitchell found this infuriating at first. He was accustomed to getting reactions from people, anger, defensiveness, frustration, but Sarah gave him nothing to push against. She simply did her job with quiet competence, treating his complaints as information rather than attacks. After a week of this, Colonel Mitchell began to pay closer attention. He watched how Sarah moved through the facility, how she interacted with other residents, how she handled difficult situations. He saw her sit with Mr. Delgado during one of his episodes, speaking quietly until the old man calmed down. He saw her spend an extra hour helping Mrs. Chen write a letter to her grandchildren. He saw her cover for another nurse who had called in sick, working a double shift without complaint. And he began to recognize something in her that he'd seen before in soldiers under his command, a controlled composure that came not from lack of feeling, but from necessity, from having learned that falling apart wasn't an option when others depended on you. One morning, as she brought him his coffee, now made exactly to his specifications, Colonel Mitchell spoke. "You military?" he asked abruptly. Sarah paused, then shook her head. "No, sir." "You move like it," he said, studying her with the sharp eyes of a man who had commanded thousands. "You carry yourself like someone who's been trained, the way you stand, the way you enter a room, the way you assess everything before you act, the way you maintain composure under pressure." Sarah set the coffee down on his bedside table. "I just try to do my job well, sir." Colonel Mitchell watched her for a long moment. "You're too young to have that kind of composure naturally," he said. "Something taught you, combat or trauma or both. I've seen enough soldiers to recognize the signs." Sarah didn't respond. She simply checked his blood pressure, noted it in his chart, and moved to leave. "You don't have to tell me," Colonel Mitchell said as she reached the door, "but I recognize it when I see it. Whatever you've been through, you came out the other side. Not everyone does. Most people break. You bent but didn't break. That takes something special." Sarah paused, her hand on the doorframe. For a moment she seemed about to speak. Then she simply nodded once and continued out. Colonel Mitchell watched her go, his expression thoughtful. He'd commanded hundreds of soldiers over his career. He knew what trauma looked like when someone tried to hide it. He knew what controlled composure looked like when it was covering something deeper. And he knew with absolute certainty that Sarah was carrying something she'd never told anyone in this building. The weeks passed. Sarah continued her routine, arriving early, making coffee, moving through her rounds with quiet precision. She covered shifts when others called in sick. She stayed late to help with evening care. She organized a Veterans Day celebration, hanging decorations and arranging for a local high school choir to perform patriotic songs. She spent her own money on decorations that looked military, but not overly patriotic. She wanted to honor their service without triggering difficult memories. She bought small American flags for each table, arranged photographs of the residents in their military days along one wall, and created a display of medals and commendations that families had donated over the years. The preparation took weeks. Sarah came in on her days off to organize everything. She contacted the high school choir director personally, explaining what she wanted. Traditional military songs, but performed gently, reverently, without the bombast that might trigger combat memories. She arranged the seating carefully, making sure residents with mobility issues had easy access, but also ensuring that those who might become overwhelmed could exit quickly if needed. During the celebration, Sarah stood at the back of the room, watching the residents sing along to the old songs. Their faces transformed, years falling away as they remembered who they had been. Mr. Harrison sat in the front row, his eyes bright, singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic, in a voice that cracked with emotion. Colonel Mitchell sat beside him, his expression softer than usual, mouthing the words to "God Bless America." Mrs. Rodriguez held hands with another resident, both of them swaying gently to amazing grace. Some of them cried, some of them smiled. All of them seemed, for a moment, to shed the weight of age and infirmity, and remember the young people they'd been when they believed they were invincible. Sarah watched Mrs. Chen, who had lost her Marine husband in Vietnam before she even knew she was pregnant. The old woman sat with tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling too, remembering the man she'd loved for only 18 months, but had mourned for 57 years. After the performance, as Sarah cleaned up the decorations, Colonel Mitchell approached her. "Thank you," he said simply. This meant something. Sarah nodded, folding a tablecloth carefully. "They've earned it." "So have you," Colonel Mitchell said quietly. "Whatever you've done, wherever you've been, you've earned respect too." Sarah met his eyes briefly, then returned to her work. "I'm just a nurse, sir." "No," Colonel Mitchell said firmly. "You're not, but I'll stop pushing. When you're ready to tell someone, I hope you'll consider me. I'm good at keeping secrets. Had to be, in my line of work." Sarah paused in her work. "Why would you want to know?" "Because I'm tired of being surrounded by people who don't understand," Colonel Mitchell said. "I'm tired of well-meaning children who tiptoe around me like I'm made of glass. I'm tired of cheerful staff members who think a smile and a pill can fix what's broken. You understand? I don't know why or how, but you do. That's worth something." The facility had a storage room in the basement where old records and equipment were kept. Sarah sometimes went there during her lunch break, preferring the quiet solitude to the crowded staff lounge. She would sit on an old folding chair, eat her sandwich, and allow herself to be still. The room smelled of dust and old paper. Weak light filtered through a small window near the ceiling. It was cool and quiet, removed from the constant demands of the floors above. In that space, Sarah could let her guard down slightly, could feel the exhaustion she kept hidden during working hours. Sometimes she would sit there and let herself remember. She would think about the field hospital in Kandahar, the smell of blood and diesel fuel, the sound of incoming mortars. She would think about the soldiers she'd saved and the ones she couldn't save. She would think about Private Morrison, who had bled out while she was trying to save 3 others. One day she noticed a box of old military medals and commendations, donations from families who didn't know what else to do with them. She carefully sorted through them, cleaning the tarnished metal with her sleeve. Each one represented a life, a service, a sacrifice. Bronze stars, Purple Hearts, Army Commendation Medals, Good Conduct Medals, campaign ribbons from wars most people had forgotten. She held each one carefully, wondering about the person who'd earned it, whether they'd been proud or haunted, whether they'd felt the recognition was deserved or insufficient. As she worked, she heard footsteps on the stairs. She looked up to see Colonel Mitchell standing in the doorway. "I thought I might find you here," he said. Sarah set down the medal she was holding. "Can I help you with something, sir?" Colonel Mitchell stepped into the room, moving slowly with his cane. "I made some calls," he said. "Asked around. There aren't many young nurses who carry themselves the way you do. Fewer still who work in places like this when they could work anywhere else." Sarah remained silent, but something in her expression shifted. Attention, a wariness. "I talked to an old friend at the Pentagon," Colonel Mitchell continued. "Asked him to look into something for me. He was reluctant at first, privacy regulations and all that, but I insisted. Told him I needed to know if my instincts were right. He owed me a favor from way back." Sarah's hands stilled on the medal box. "Captain Sarah Mendez," Colonel Mitchell said quietly. "Army Nurse Corps. Served 2 tours in Afghanistan 2018 to 2020. Attached to forward operating bases, field hospitals under fire. You were there for the Kandahar bombing in 2019. You were there when they lost 12 soldiers in one night, trying to evacuate a collapsed compound." Sarah looked down at the medal in her hands, a bronze star, tarnished and forgotten, belonging to someone whose name was lost to time. "So you left the military 3 years ago," Colonel Mitchell continued. "Honorable discharge, came here, changed your credentials slightly, never told anyone about your service." The silence stretched between them, heavy and profound. "It didn't seem relevant," Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Didn't seem relevant." Colonel Mitchell's voice sharpened with disbelief. "You were decorated. Bronze Star with Valor device. Army Commendation Medal. You saved lives under fire. You performed surgeries in conditions that would have broken most doctors. "I did my job," Sarah interrupted gently but firmly. "Just like I do now. Nothing more, nothing less." "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Colonel Mitchell pressed. "Why hide it?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, still holding the tarnished bronze star. "Because here, I'm just a nurse. I'm not a veteran or a hero or someone who needs to be thanked for her service. I'm not someone people look at with pity or awe or uncomfortable gratitude. I'm not someone who has to explain why I left, why I can't go back, why I wake up some nights unable to breathe. I'm just someone doing a job. It's simpler that way." "Simpler," Colonel Mitchell repeated. "Or safer?" Sarah looked at him directly for the first time since he'd entered the room. "Both." Colonel Mitchell lowered himself slowly into a chair, his cane propped against his knee. "Tell me about Kandahar, the night of March 15th, 2019. "No?" "Sarah." "Captain Mendez, if you're going to use my rank," Sarah said, her voice still quiet but with an edge of steel beneath it. "And I don't talk about Kandahar. Not with therapists, not with family, not with anyone." "Why not?" "Because talking about it doesn't change what happened. It doesn't bring back the 5 soldiers I couldn't save. It doesn't undo the decisions I made when I had to choose who got treatment first and who had to wait. It doesn't make the memories go away. It doesn't stop me from seeing their faces every time I close my eyes." Her voice remained steady, but her hands gripped the edge of the box tightly enough that her knuckles went white. Colonel Mitchell watched her carefully. "How do you carry it?" "The same way you carry Korea and Vietnam," Sarah said. "The same way Mr. Harrison carries his 3 men. The same way everyone in this building carries what they can't put down. I get up every morning. I make coffee. I do my job. I try to be useful to people who understand what it means to carry things that don't go away. And I don't talk about it, because talking doesn't help. Only doing helps. Only serving helps." "Does it help, being here?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Yes, because they don't need me to explain. They don't need me to justify or defend or prove anything. They know what it's like to come home and feel like you don't fit anywhere. They know what it's like to carry things that civilians can't understand. They know what it's like to be thanked for your service by people who have no idea what that service cost. We just exist together. We understand each other without words." Colonel Mitchell nodded slowly. "Does anyone else know?" "No, sir, and I'd prefer to keep it that way." "Why?" "Because the moment people know, everything changes. They treat you differently. They either put you on a pedestal or treat you like you're fragile and damaged. They thank you for your service with that look in their eyes, that mixture of guilt and gratitude and relief that it was you and not them. They ask questions they don't really want answers to. I didn't come here to be seen that way. I came here to be invisible, to be normal, to be useful without being special. You're not invisible, Colonel Mitchell said gently. Not to the residents. We see you, we just didn't know the whole story. Sarah set the metal box aside. And now that you do? Now I understand why you knew how to sit with Mr. Delgado at 3 in the morning without needing to say anything. I understand why you never flinch when Mr. Patterson has his episodes. I understand why you treat every single one of us like we matter, like what we did meant something. Because you know what it's like to serve, to sacrifice, to carry the weight of impossible decisions. Sarah was quiet. You came here because you needed us as much as we needed you, Colonel Mitchell continued. That hasn't changed. A rank and a history don't change that. Sarah took a breath. I couldn't save them all, she said finally, her voice breaking slightly. That night, the Kandahar bombing. I tried, but I couldn't save them all. 5 soldiers died because I wasn't fast enough, wasn't skilled enough, wasn't— Stop, Colonel Mitchell said firmly but kindly. I've been exactly where you are. I've carried the exact same weight. Do you know how many soldiers I sent into situations where I knew some wouldn't come back? Do you know how many times I had to make decisions that meant choosing between bad options and worse options? Command means carrying that weight every single day. So does battlefield medicine. You made the choices you had to make with the information and resources you had in that moment. Those 5 soldiers didn't die because you failed them. They died because war is brutal and random and unfair, and sometimes the injuries are too severe, and the conditions are too impossible, and there's simply nothing more that can be done. Sarah felt tears slide down her face. She didn't try to stop them. For the first time in 3 years, she let someone see her cry. You know what the difference is between the ones who survive that weight and the ones who don't? Colonel Mitchell asked gently. Sarah shook her head, unable to speak past the emotion lodged in her throat. The ones who survive find a way to keep serving. They find a way to make their continued existence count for something. You didn't stop serving when you left the military. You didn't run away from the weight or pretend it didn't exist. You just changed who you were serving and how you served them. These people here, we're still fighting battles. Not with bullets or bombs, but we're fighting loneliness and despair and pain and the feeling that everything we did was meaningless. You save us from those battles every single day. You save us by showing up with coffee and patience and the kind of understanding that can only come from someone who's been through their own hell and survived it. Is it enough? Sarah asked quietly, her voice raw with pain and doubt. Does it balance against the ones I couldn't save? No, Colonel Mitchell said honestly. It never balances, it never erases, but it matters, it counts, and every person you help here is a victory against the darkness. That has to be enough because it's all any of us can do. They sat in silence for a while, 2 people who understood things that couldn't be fully explained to those who hadn't lived them. I won't tell anyone, Colonel Mitchell said finally. But you should know what you're doing here matters. It matters as much as anything you did over there. Maybe more because you're choosing to do it every day, without orders, without recognition, without anyone forcing you to care. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Thank you, sir. Colonel Mitchell pushed himself up with his cane. And stop calling me sir. We're the same rank. For the first time in the conversation, Sarah smiled, a small, watery smile, but genuine. Yes, sir. Colonel Mitchell shook his head, almost smiling himself. Impossible, woman. He made his way back upstairs, leaving Sarah alone with her sandwich and the box of forgotten medals. The months continued. Sarah maintained her routine, and Colonel Mitchell kept her secret. But something had shifted between them. He was less combative, more engaged. He started attending the activities Sarah organized. He helped her set up for events. He even started drinking the coffee she made each morning, admitting grudgingly that it was significantly better than anything he could make himself. He also began serving as an unofficial advocate for her with the other residents and their families. When new arrivals complained about the food or the accommodations, Colonel Mitchell would tell them sharply that they were lucky to have Sarah as their nurse. When families questioned treatment decisions, Colonel Mitchell would defend Sarah's judgment without hesitation. One winter morning, Sarah arrived to find the parking lot full of unfamiliar vehicles. Black sedans and official-looking cars lined the street. Military vehicles she recognized immediately, though they were unmarked. Her stomach tightened with anxiety, but she continued inside, carrying her usual coffee. The facility director met her in the hallway, looking flustered and confused. "Sarah, there are military officers here," she said, wringing her hands. "Multiple officers, high-ranking. They're asking for you specifically." "I don't understand what's happening." Sarah felt her heart rate increase but kept her expression calm. "Where are they?" "In the common area." She walked down the hallway, her footsteps measured despite her anxiety. When she entered the common area, she saw 3 officers in dress uniforms standing at attention. The residents were scattered around the room, watching with confused curiosity. Colonel Mitchell stood near the window, his expression unreadable. The senior officer, an army colonel, stepped forward when he saw Sarah. "Captain Mendez?" Sarah stopped. The room went completely silent. "I'm not active duty," Sarah said quietly. "I haven't been Captain Mendez in 3 years." "Once a captain, always a captain," the officer said. "I'm Colonel David Warren, U.S. Army Medical Command. May we speak with you?" Sarah glanced around the room. Every eye was on her. "Whatever you need to say, you can say it here." Colonel Warren nodded. "Very well. Captain Mendez, I'm here on behalf of the Department of Defense and the Army Medical Command. We've recently completed a comprehensive review of combat operations in Afghanistan from 2018 to 2020. As part of this review, several actions were identified as having been inadequately recognized at the time due to administrative oversights." Sarah remained still, her face carefully neutral. "On the night of March 15, 2019, your forward operating base in Kandahar province came under sustained attack. The field hospital where you were stationed took direct hits from mortar fire. The facility was partially destroyed. Casualties were extensive. Do you remember that night?" Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes. The official record shows that you personally treated 43 wounded soldiers under fire over a period of 7 hours. You performed emergency surgeries without adequate equipment, without proper lighting, working by flashlight and headlamp in a partially collapsed structure. When the evacuation helicopters couldn't land due to continued enemy fire, you kept those soldiers alive until extraction was possible. Of the 43 soldiers you treated that night, 38 survived. The common area was absolutely silent. Military analysts have determined that without your actions, given the severity of the injuries and the conditions, the survival rate would have been less than 20%. Your decisions under fire, your surgical skill under impossible conditions, and your refusal to abandon your post despite repeated orders to evacuate are credited with saving at least 20 additional lives." Colonel Mitchell's eyes widened. "Mrs. Rodriguez brought her hand to her mouth. Mr. Harrison sat forward in his wheelchair. "At the time," Colonel Warren continued, "you were awarded the Bronze Star Medal with Valor Device and the Army Commendation Medal for your actions that night. Your commanding officer submitted a recommendation for higher recognition, but that recommendation was lost when your unit rotated home. It has been determined that this recognition was insufficient." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small box. He opened it slowly, revealing the Distinguished Service Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor. "Captain Sarah Mendez, on behalf of the President of the United States, the Secretary of Defense, and the United States Army, it is my honor to present you with the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism in action against an armed enemy." Sarah stood frozen. She couldn't speak. She couldn't move. She felt the weight of that night crashing back over her with crushing force. The screams of wounded soldiers, the overwhelming smell of blood and burning plastic, the impossible decisions about who to treat first when everyone was dying. "You don't have to accept it here," Colonel Warren said gently, seeing the distress in her face. "We can arrange a private ceremony if you prefer." Sarah shook her head slowly. She looked around the room at the residents. She saw Mr. Harrison with tears streaming down his face. She saw Mrs. Chen clutching her hands to her chest. She saw Colonel Mitchell standing at attention, his eyes bright with emotion. "They should know," Sarah said quietly. "They should know that we don't forget, that what they did mattered, that someone still remembers." The officer nodded. "Will you accept this recognition?" Sarah took a breath and straightened her posture, decades of training overriding her emotional turmoil. "Yes, sir." The officers moved through the formal presentation with military precision. They pinned the medal to Sarah's simple nurse's uniform. They saluted her. The residents who were able stood and saluted as well. Mr. Harrison struggled to his feet with his walker, his whole body shaking with the effort, but he remained standing throughout the entire salute. Mrs. Rodriguez stood at perfect attention despite her arthritis. Colonel Mitchell's salute was parade ground perfect. When the ceremony concluded, the officers departed. The facility director stood speechless. The other nurses stared at Sarah as though seeing her for the first time. Sarah stood in the center of the common area, the weight of the medal strange against her chest, feeling exposed and vulnerable in ways she hadn't felt since leaving the military. Colonel Mitchell approached slowly. He stopped in front of her and rendered a perfect salute. "Captain," he said simply. Sarah's eyes filled with tears she'd held back for years. She returned the salute, her hand shaking slightly. One by one, the other veterans who were able approached. They shook her hand. They saluted. They thanked her. Not for the medal, but for understanding, for being one of them. Mr. Harrison gripped her hand with surprising strength. "You've been carrying us," he said, his voice breaking. "All this time, you've been carrying us the way you carried those soldiers." Sarah couldn't speak. She simply nodded, tears streaming down her face. That evening, after her shift ended, Sarah sat in her car in the parking lot for a long time. She held the medal case in her hands, staring at it. Her phone buzzed. A text from Colonel Mitchell. "Coffee tomorrow morning." Sarah smiled despite herself. She texted back, "Same time as always." The next morning, Sarah arrived at her usual time. She made coffee in the staff lounge, the familiar ritual grounding her. She poured 2 cups and carried them to the common area. Colonel Mitchell was already there, sitting in his usual chair. Sarah handed him a cup and sat down beside him. They drank in comfortable silence for several minutes. "Are you going to leave?" Colonel Mitchell asked finally. Sarah considered the question. "I don't know. I liked being invisible here. Now I'm not." "You were never invisible," Colonel Mitchell said. "Not to us. We always saw you. We just didn't know the whole story. And now that you do?" Colonel Mitchell looked at her. "Now we understand why you knew how to sit with Mr. Delgado at 3 in the morning. We understand why you never flinch when Mr. Patterson has his episodes. We understand why you treat every single one of us like we matter." Sarah was quiet. "You came here because you needed us as much as we needed you," Colonel Mitchell continued. "That hasn't changed." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "I couldn't save them all," she said finally. "That night, 5 soldiers died." "The ones who survive find a way to keep serving," Colonel Mitchell said. "You didn't stop. You just changed who you were serving. These people here, you save them every day. Not from bullets or bombs, from loneliness, from feeling forgotten." Sarah felt tears slide down her face. "Stay," Colonel Mitchell said quietly. "Let us know who you are. It doesn't diminish your work. It honors it." Over the following weeks, Sarah gradually adjusted to her new visibility. The staff treated her with more respect. The residents treated her exactly the same, with the affection and gratitude they'd always shown her. She continued her routine. She arrived early. She made coffee. She brought it to whoever needed it. She sat with Mr. Delgado during his nightmares. She listened to Mr. Harrison talk about his lost men. She organized activities. She covered extra shifts. She did exactly what she had always done. But now, when new residents arrived, Colonel Mitchell would pull them aside and quietly tell them about the young nurse who brought coffee every morning. He would tell them that she understood, that she'd been there too, that she was one of them. And sometimes late at night, when the facility was quiet and Sarah was finishing her rounds, she would stop in the common area and look at the residents sleeping peacefully. She would think about the soldiers she'd saved and the soldiers she couldn't save. She would think about service and sacrifice and the invisible work of simply showing up every day. She would think about how healing wasn't always dramatic or recognized. Sometimes it was just making coffee and sitting in silence. Sometimes it was just being present when someone needed to be seen. One morning, several months after the medal ceremony, Sarah arrived to find a small group gathered in the common area. The residents had organized something. "We wanted to do something," Colonel Mitchell said as Sarah approached. "You've been taking care of us for 3 years. We wanted to take care of you for once." Mr. Harrison wheeled forward. He held a frame in his lap. Inside was a photograph of Sarah with all the residents, taken during the Veterans' Day celebration. Below it was a plaque engraved with simple words, "Captain Sarah Mendez, Army Nurse Corps. She served with honor abroad. She serves with love here. We are grateful." Sarah stared at it, unable to speak. "You don't have to hang it up, Mr. Harrison said. "We know you don't like attention, but we wanted you to know that we see you, we've always seen you." Sarah knelt down beside his wheelchair. "Thank you," she whispered. "All of you. Thank you. Mrs." Chen stepped forward and placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You gave us our dignity back," she said. "Every day you remind us that we matter. That's worth more than any medal." The other residents nodded in agreement. Sarah looked around at their faces, weathered, scarred, bearing the marks of lives fully lived and battles fought. She saw herself reflected in them. "I'll stay," she said quietly, though no one had asked. "I'll keep staying." Colonel Mitchell smiled. "We know that's who you are." Sarah stood, holding the frame carefully. She made a fresh pot of coffee, poured 2 cups, and sat down with Colonel Mitchell. They drank in comfortable silence, watching the morning sun stream through the windows, illuminating the common area where 42 veterans and one who refused to stop serving found what they all needed most. Not recognition, not medals, not praise, just someone who understood, someone who showed up, someone who remembered, and in that understanding, that daily presence, that quiet remembering, they all found a way to heal. If you've ever known someone whose quiet service went unrecognized until one moment revealed everything they'd carried in silence, I'd like to hear about it in the comments below.